Beloit City Council is discussing data center development at City Hall Tuesday night. Now, members say no proposal sits in front of council, but right now, some members want to start the conversation before a plan is offered. Community members who spoke during public comment asked the city leaders to look at possible rules, including an 18-month moratorium. Miriam Niesmeyer is back from that council meeting, and Miriam, residents tell you that they want city leaders to learn more about data centers before any proposal is brought before the board.
The current data center proposal involves the town of Beloit and town of Turtle, not the city of Beloit. But tonight's discussion focuses on whether Beloit should prepare its own rules before any future plan reaches city limits.
Don't just let the voices be the billion-dollar companies and the developers and the unions that want these jobs. Make sure the people who actually live here want it.
Dozens filled Beloit City Hall Tuesday night to ask city leaders to look at a data center development before any proposal reaches their desk.
And I would really urge the city council to take this, to really put the brakes on making decisions on this. I don't think we know enough. I don't think the county knows enough about data center development. I don't think the state knows enough.
The conversation comes as residents in the region raise concerns about large-scale data center proposals near the town of Beloit and town of Turtle.
This is going to be one of the biggest developments in Wisconsin if it comes to fruition, so I think it's a little naive to not entertain the fact that this will be something that affects the entire area.
Council Vice President Yusuf Adama says he helped put the discussion regarding future data center development on the agenda after hearing concerns from community members.
A lot of the bigger problems that we hear is about transparency. It's about NDAs being signed. It's about these developments showing up on people's doorsteps and them not feeling like they ever had a chance to really have a proper say in how they get there.
Adama says the city of Beloit does not have active data center projects at the moment. He adds the discussion gives people a public place to raise concerns early.
This is a really important issue to the public right now.
Dozens of people who spoke during public comment raised concerns that if a data center does come to fruition, it will impact the environment like noise, light, and water pollution.
Residents tell us they feel their concerns were heard by council. Members say they plan to explore information about data centers.